Good afternoon, ride, yo. I'm finna try this storytelling thing out one more time. Actually, I'm gonna try it out a bunch more times than that. But check me out. Whoopsies. Almost went down the wrong way. Alright. How I wanna start this off. I got it. So consciousness, right? No. Scratch that. Start like this. In the beginning, there was everything. But a sentience might say that there was nothing. Consciousness is kind of like a virus. It's a logic plague. It's what happens when you start thinking about yourself more than the bodily functions. It's what happens when you start thinking about yourself outside of reaction. And that idea folds on itself and keeps folding on itself until you become conscious. And consciousness, it affects everything. Like almost like an infection. Like it always changes everything around it, making the things around it behave consciously. Not that they are conscious, they just behave consciously because there's something conscious around them. My bad for pausing the story. Somebody almost crashed over there. That was wild. Anyway, back to the story. You have a worm species on a planet. It looks similar to an earthworm, except for the top section, which you can call the head if you would like, is plated like scales, but hard scales. And it uses that to burrow into the ground more effectively. There's a bunch of them together. They tend to cluster, this particular species of worm. And they hang out around a specific area in the ground, like a specific distance from the molten area versus from the top layer of soil. One day, one of these worms went up towards the surface, as they often do. And when they do this, they typically get eaten. Sometimes they find food and stuff up there. That's why they keep doing it. But sometimes, a bird or something will pick them up. On this particular day, a bird picked this worm up. And now this worm is up in the air. None of its senses are working, because all of its senses are designed for it to be inside the dirt. And without being encapsulated by dirt, it can't really sense anything. So now it senses everything. But up in the air, as it is, away from its friends, surrounded by enemies that want to eat it, something happened to the bird. So the bird dropped the worm probably a couple 100 feet away from where it was picked up at. Once the worm was back on the ground, it slid around back into the ground and went underground. This experience of sensing nothing and in turn sensing everything changed the worm. Now the worm goes down instead of up. And this idea that the worm needs to go down more and not go up gave the worm momentary consciousness, which in turn infected the DNA of this particular worm. So the worm went down and it used the plates on his head. But in order to go deeper in the ground, as the ground gets tougher to dig through, it needs more plating to move. The worm doesn't know that. But that fear of going up and that need to go down infected the DNA. It caused certain things in the worm's DNA to activate that weren't activated before. So when the worm breeds, the new worms aren't born with consciousness. But for some strange reason, these new worms have more plates. That conscious worm died. It didn't leave any conscious offspring. But it did leave worms that now have more plates. And that more plating is still active in those worms. And those worms have kids, and now those worms have more plates. More plates mean they can go deeper into the earth. And those worms have kids, and they have more plates. Deeper into the earth, there's less organic matter down there. A lot less. Makes the worms filthy. Makes the worms crazy. Almost, you could say. Less food means less worms. So the worms need to either venture back upwards, but there's something about their DNA that tells them not to do that, or they would need to eat each other. Now the worms are covered in plates by this point, but the only organic matter for them to eat is each other. They're not ready to do that yet. Not all of them. Some of the worms decided to go back up, completely against their DNA. Some of the worms that stayed down became aware of the lack of food, and they started to eat other worms. The worms that were eating the worms became momentarily conscious. The worms that decided to go up became momentarily conscious. Now you have two different kinds of conscious worms after only a couple of generations. When they breed children, they still don't breed more conscious worms, but the effects of that momentary consciousness is still imprinted on the DNA of those worms. We don't know how far these momentary spurts of consciousness will get these worms, but we do know that we have a plated worm that's headed towards the surface, and we have a plated worm that likes to eat other worms. And that's where we're going to end this tale about consciousness.